The sun was setting over Interstate 40 when Officer Derek Morgan spotted the black Peterbilt semi with Tennessee plates. He had been parked at his usual spot for 3 hours waiting for the right target. Derek was good at picking them. Out-of-state drivers were best because they rarely came back to fight charges. Commercial truckers were even better because they could not afford to miss deliveries or lose their licenses. Derek had been running this scheme for 3 years and had made over $200,000 in cash that never showed up on any official report. He pulled out onto the highway and accelerated until he was behind the semi. The truck was moving exactly at the speed limit and staying in the right lane. Derek ran the plates through his system and waited. The results came back clean. No warrants and no violations, and the registration was current. That did not matter to Derek because he had never needed a real reason to make a stop. He flipped on his lights and waited for the truck to pull over. Marcus Williams saw the flashing lights in his mirror and felt his stomach tighten. He had been driving for 12 years and had been through dozens of routine stops. But ever since El Paso, nothing felt routine anymore. 3 years ago, Marcus had been making a delivery to a warehouse on the outskirts of town when he walked in at exactly the wrong moment. He saw 7 men lined up against a wall and 3 men with guns. Before Marcus could back out, one of the gunmen turned and fired. Marcus ran. He made it to his truck and drove straight to the nearest police station. The men he saw executed that night were members of a rival gang. The shooters were from the Valdez cartel. Marcus spent 8 hours giving his statement and describing everything he remembered. 2 weeks later, the FBI came to his door and told him his life was in danger. They offered him a choice: testify and enter witness protection or refuse and take his chances. Marcus had a daughter in college and an ex-wife who depended on his child support payments. He could not take chances. He testified. 17 cartel members went to prison, including 2 high-ranking leaders. Marcus Williams became Marcus Williams in name only. The FBI gave him a new background and new papers and a new life driving trucks across the country. They monitored him constantly through his phone and through GPS tracking on his truck. He had an emergency app that would bring federal agents running if he ever needed help. Marcus hoped he would never need it. He pulled the semi onto the shoulder and put it in park. His hands went to the top of the steering wheel where they would be visible. He took a slow breath and waited. Through his mirror, he watched the officer get out of his patrol car. The officer was white and around 40 years old with a thick build and a confident walk. He approached the driver's side door with one hand resting on his belt. Marcus rolled down his window before the officer reached it. Derek looked up at the driver. The man was black and somewhere in his 30s with short hair and calm eyes. His hands were on the wheel and he was not moving. Derek had seen 1,000 drivers just like this one, polite and nervous and ready to do whatever it took to avoid trouble. This was going to be easy. Derek asked for license and registration. Marcus reached slowly for his wallet and pulled out his license. Then he leaned over to the glove box and retrieved the registration and insurance papers. He handed everything down to Derek without saying anything except, "Yes, sir." Derek took the papers and walked back to his patrol car. He sat down and pretended to run the information through his computer. Everything would come back clean because Derek had already checked. But he needed to make the driver wait. Waiting made them nervous. Nervous drivers were easier to shake down. After 10 minutes, Derek walked back to the truck. He handed the papers back up to Marcus and told him there was a problem. Derek said he had received an anonymous tip about drug trafficking on this route and that he needed to inspect the vehicle. Marcus felt his chest tighten but kept his face neutral. He asked if he was being detained or if he was free to go. Derek smiled and said this was just a routine inspection and that it would only take a few minutes. He told Marcus to step out of the truck. Marcus climbed down from the cab. As soon as his feet hit the ground, he reached into his pocket and pressed the sequence of buttons on his phone that would activate the emergency signal. The app did not make any sound or show any notification. It simply sent a message to the FBI with his exact location and a code that meant he needed immediate assistance. Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned to face Derek. Derek told Marcus to stand by the side of the road while he conducted the inspection. Marcus walked to the shoulder and waited. He watched Derek circle the truck and check the cargo doors. Everything was locked and sealed because Marcus was carrying electronics from a distribution center in Memphis to a retailer in Phoenix. Derek spent a few minutes looking at the seals and then moved to the cab. He climbed up into the driver's seat and started looking around. Marcus knew what was coming. He had heard stories from other drivers about cops planting drugs or finding reasons to write tickets that could only be fixed with cash payments. Marcus had always thought he was safe because of his FBI protection. Now he was not so sure. Derek reached under the driver's seat and pulled out a small plastic bag. He held it up and looked at it like he had just discovered something terrible. Then he climbed down from the cab and walked over to Marcus. He showed Marcus the bag and said it appeared to be methamphetamine. Marcus looked at the bag and then at Derek. He said he had never seen that before and that someone must have planted it. Derek shook his head and said that was what they all said. He told Marcus that possession of illegal drugs was a serious crime, and that Marcus was now being detained for investigation. Marcus asked if he could make a phone call. Derek said no. He said Marcus was not under arrest yet, so he did not have the right to a phone call. Derek put the bag back in his patrol car and then returned to where Marcus was standing. He looked around to make sure no other cars were coming. Then he spoke in a lower voice. He told Marcus that this situation could go one of two ways. Marcus could be arrested and charged with drug trafficking, which would mean losing his commercial license and probably going to jail. Or Marcus could pay a fine right here and the whole thing would disappear. No arrest and no record and no problems. Derek said the fine was $5,000 in cash. Marcus looked at Derek and felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. He told Derek he did not have $5,000 in cash. Derek shrugged and said that was unfortunate because the alternative was arrest and prosecution. He said Marcus would lose everything: his truck and his license and his freedom. Derek had given this speech dozens of times and it always worked. Drivers always found a way to come up with the money. Some had it hidden in their trucks. Others called family members or friends. A few tried to negotiate the amount down. Derek was flexible on price as long as he got something, but he always started high. Marcus asked again if he could make a phone call. Derek was getting annoyed now. He said no for the second time and added that Marcus needed to decide quickly because Derek had other work to do. Marcus nodded slowly and said he needed a few minutes to think. Derek checked his watch and said Marcus had 5 minutes. Then he walked back to his patrol car to wait. He sat in the driver's seat and watched Marcus through the windshield. The truck driver was standing by the side of the road with his arms crossed, looking down at the ground. Derek had seen that look before. It was the look of someone trying to figure out how to get out of an impossible situation. Derek smiled. This was the part he enjoyed most. What Derek did not know was that 23 minutes earlier, when Marcus pressed the emergency sequence on his phone, a message had been sent to a secure server at the FBI field office in Phoenix. The message contained Marcus Williams' identification code and his GPS coordinates and a priority level that meant immediate response required. Within 2 minutes of receiving the message, Special Agent Lisa Martinez had been notified. She was at her desk finishing paperwork when her phone buzzed with the alert. She looked at the screen and her expression changed immediately. She grabbed her jacket and her weapon and ran to the parking garage. She shouted for 3 other agents to come with her. They climbed into 2 black SUVs and left the building with lights flashing. Lisa had been Marcus Williams' handler for 2 years. She knew his route and his schedule, and she checked in with him twice a week. Marcus was one of the most important witnesses the FBI had ever protected. His testimony had destroyed a major cartel operation and had saved dozens of lives. The cartel had put a price on his head that was rumored to be $500,000. Lisa and her team had kept him safe by keeping him moving and keeping him hidden. Now someone had stopped him on a desert highway, and that meant potential danger. Lisa pushed the SUV up to 90 miles per hour and headed west on Interstate 40. The GPS showed Marcus was 32 miles away. She radioed the other vehicle and told them to stay close. She also contacted the local police department and told them to stay away from the scene. This was now a federal matter. Derek was getting impatient. He looked at his watch again and saw that 6 minutes had passed. He got out of his patrol car and walked back over to Marcus. He asked if Marcus had made a decision. Marcus looked up and said he could not pay $5,000. Derek sighed and reached for his handcuffs. He told Marcus to turn around and put his hands behind his back. Marcus did not move. He asked Derek if he was absolutely sure he wanted to arrest him. Derek stopped and looked at Marcus with suspicion. He asked what that was supposed to mean. Marcus said nothing. He just stood there looking calm. Too calm. Derek felt a small, uncomfortable feeling in his stomach, but he pushed it away. He had done this too many times to get nervous now. He grabbed Marcus by the arm and told him to turn around. Marcus turned around slowly and put his hands behind his back. Derek was reaching for his handcuffs when he heard the sound of vehicles approaching fast. 2 black SUVs came around the curve with their lights flashing. They slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder in front of Marcus' truck. Derek let go of Marcus' arm and stepped back. He watched as 4 people got out of the vehicles. They were all wearing dark suits and they all had badges clipped to their belts. The woman in front walked directly toward Derek with her badge held up. She was in her late 30s with dark hair pulled back and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She stopped 3 feet away from Derek and introduced herself as Special Agent Lisa Martinez with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She asked Derek what was going on. Derek felt his confidence waver, but he recovered quickly. He was still a cop and this was still his jurisdiction. He told Lisa that he had stopped this vehicle for a routine inspection and had discovered illegal narcotics. He said the driver was being detained for investigation. Lisa looked past Derek at Marcus. She asked if he was all right. Marcus nodded and said he was fine. Lisa turned back to Derek and asked to see the drugs. Derek walked to his patrol car and retrieved the plastic bag. He brought it back and held it up for Lisa to see. She took the bag from him and examined it closely. She asked Derek where exactly he had found it. Derek pointed to the truck and said it was under the driver's seat. Lisa nodded and asked if she could inspect the truck herself. Derek hesitated. He did not want anyone looking too closely at his crime scene, but he could not refuse a federal agent without raising suspicion. He said that would be fine. Lisa walked to the truck with one of her agents. They climbed up into the cab and spent several minutes looking around. They took photographs of the driver's seat and the area underneath. They checked the glove box and the storage compartments. Derek watched from the ground and felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Something was wrong. Federal agents did not show up to routine traffic stops, and they definitely did not show up this fast unless they already knew something. Derek started running through everything he had done in the past hour trying to figure out what he had missed. He came up empty. Lisa climbed down from the truck and walked back to Derek. She asked if he had activated his body camera during the stop. Derek said there had been a technical problem and the camera was not working. Lisa asked about his dashboard camera. Derek said it had been turned off for maintenance. Lisa looked at him for a long moment without saying anything. Then she asked Derek if he knew who Marcus Williams was. Derek said he was just a truck driver. Lisa shook her head. She told Derek that Marcus Williams was a federally protected witness in a major organized crime case. She said that any interference with his safety or his freedom was a federal crime. She said that the FBI had been monitoring this stop from the moment it began, and that they had serious questions about Derek's conduct. Derek felt the blood drain from his face. He tried to speak, but his mouth was too dry. Lisa continued. She said that the FBI would be conducting a full investigation into this incident. She said they would be examining Derek's financial records and his phone records and his patrol car records. She said they would be interviewing other drivers who had been stopped by Derek on this highway. She said Derek should strongly consider obtaining legal representation. Derek finally found his voice. He said this was all a misunderstanding. He said he was just doing his job. Lisa did not look convinced. She told Derek that he was free to leave, but that he should expect to hear from federal investigators very soon. She took the plastic bag of drugs with her as evidence. Derek walked back to his patrol car on shaking legs. He sat down behind the wheel and gripped the steering wheel with both hands. His entire body was trembling. Everything he had built over 3 years was about to come crashing down, and he knew it. Lisa watched Derek drive away and then turned to Marcus. She asked him if Derek had hurt him or threatened him in any way. Marcus shook his head and said Derek had been careful not to cross that line. He had just planted drugs and tried to extort money. Lisa told Marcus they needed to get him somewhere safe while they sorted this out. Marcus asked if he could finish his delivery first. Lisa smiled slightly and said no. She said the FBI would handle the delivery, and that Marcus needed to come with them. Marcus sighed but nodded. He knew the drill. Whenever something happened that might compromise his safety, the FBI moved him immediately. He grabbed his bag from the truck and climbed into one of the SUVs. They drove Marcus to a safe house in Phoenix. It was a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood with furniture that looked like it came from a hotel. Marcus had stayed in places like this before. They all looked the same. Lisa told him to get some rest and that someone would be by in the morning to take his statement. Then she left with her team to begin the investigation. Marcus sat on the couch and stared at the blank television screen. He thought about Derek and the fear he had seen in the cop eyes when Lisa revealed who Marcus really was. Marcus did not feel sorry for Derek, he felt angry. Angry that someone who was supposed to protect people had instead used his power to hurt them. Marcus had met plenty of good cops over the years, men and women who took their oath seriously and tried to make things better. But he had also met cops like Derek, cops who saw their badge as a license to take whatever they wanted. The next morning, Lisa came back with 2 other agents. They set up a recording device on the kitchen table and asked Marcus to tell them everything that happened. Marcus went through the whole stop from beginning to end. He described how Derek had acted and what he had said and how the drugs had suddenly appeared. The agents took notes and asked questions. When Marcus was finished, Lisa thanked him and told him they were going to build a case against Derek. She said it would take time, but they had enough to start with. Marcus asked how long he would need to stay in the safe house. Lisa said probably a few weeks until they could be certain Derek had not told anyone about Marcus' identity. Marcus nodded. He was used to waiting. While Marcus waited in the safe house, Lisa and her team went to work. They started by obtaining a federal warrant for Derek financial records. The warrant was approved within hours because a federal judge took threats against protected witnesses very seriously. The FBI pulled Derek bank statements going back 3 years. What they found confirmed their suspicions. Derek had been depositing large amounts of cash into his account at irregular intervals. The deposits never matched his police salary, and there was no legitimate explanation for where the money was coming from. Over 3 years, Derek had deposited almost $250,000 in unexplained cash. The FBI also found that Derek had opened 2 separate accounts at different banks. He had been spreading the money around to avoid detection. Lisa next obtained warrants for Derek phone records and his patrol car data. The phone records showed dozens of calls to numbers that belonged to known criminals in the area. Some of the numbers were linked to drug dealers. Others were linked to people who had been arrested by Derek and then released without charges. The pattern was clear. Derek was not just extorting truck drivers. He was working with criminals. The patrol car data was even more damaging. Derek had claimed that his dashboard camera and body camera malfunctioned frequently, but the data logs showed that Derek had manually turned off both cameras dozens of times over the past year. Each time he turned them off, it was right before he made a traffic stop. After the stop, he would turn them back on. Derek had been deliberately hiding his activities. Armed with this evidence, Lisa began contacting other truck drivers who had been stopped by Derek. The FBI had access to Derek patrol records which listed every stop he had made. Lisa and her team called drivers who had been stopped in the past 2 years. Many of them refused to talk at first because they were afraid or embarrassed. But once Lisa explained that this was a federal investigation and that they would not face any charges, some of them started opening up. They told stories that were almost identical to what had happened to Marcus. Derek would find some minor violation or claim to have found drugs. Then he would offer to make it all go away for a cash payment. Most of them had paid because fighting it seemed impossible. One driver said he had paid Derek $3,000 because he could not afford to miss his delivery deadline. Another driver said he had paid $1,500 because he had a prior conviction and was afraid of going back to jail. A third driver said he had refused to pay and Derek had arrested him. The driver spent 2 days in jail before the charges were dropped for lack of evidence. By the time he got out, he had lost his job and his truck had been impounded. The legal fees and impound fees had cost him over $10,000. Lisa compiled all of these statements into a report. She also discovered something else. Several of the drivers who had paid Derek worked for companies that were later targeted by drug enforcement raids. It appeared that Derek was not just stealing money. He was also gathering intelligence for drug traffickers. He would stop trucks, search them, and report back to his criminal contacts about what routes were being used and what cargo was being moved. The drug traffickers would use this information to avoid detection or to identify potential targets. Derek was not just a corrupt cop. He was an active participant in organized crime. The FBI expanded their investigation to include Derek contacts in the criminal world. They identified a man named Carlos Ruiz who appeared to be Derek's main contact. Carlos was a mid-level operator in a regional drug trafficking network that moved product from Mexico into the southwestern United States. Phone records showed that Derek and Carlos had been in regular contact for over 2 years. The FBI obtained a warrant to tap Carlos' phone, and within a week they had recorded several conversations in which Carlos discussed paying Derek for information. The recordings were clear evidence of conspiracy. Lisa brought all of this evidence to the U.S. Attorney Office. The assistant U.S. attorney assigned to the case was a woman named Linda Hayes. She reviewed the evidence and agreed that they had more than enough to charge Derek with multiple federal crimes. Linda began drafting an indictment that included charges of racketeering, extortion, conspiracy to distribute drugs, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights. Each charge carried significant prison time. If convicted on all counts, Derek would likely spend the rest of his life in federal prison. Before they arrested Derek, Lisa wanted to give him one chance to cooperate. She knew that Derek had information about the drug trafficking network that could help the FBI take down other criminals. She called Derek and asked him to come to the FBI office for an interview. Derek arrived with a lawyer. The lawyer was a man named Greg Palmer, who specialized in defending police officers accused of misconduct. Greg had a reputation for being aggressive and effective. He walked into the interview room with Derek and immediately told Lisa that his client would not be answering any questions. Lisa smiled and said that was fine. She said she just wanted Derek to hear what the FBI had found. Then she laid out the evidence piece by piece. She showed Derek his bank records with the unexplained deposits. She showed him the phone records linking him to Carlos Ruiz. She showed him the patrol car data proving he had turned off his cameras deliberately. She showed him the statements from other truck drivers describing his extortion scheme. When she was finished, she looked at Derek and asked if he wanted to reconsider his position. Greg whispered something to Derek. Derek shook his head. He said he wanted a lawyer and would not be making any statements. Lisa stood up and thanked them for coming. She said Derek should expect to be arrested within the week. Greg and Derek left the building in silence. Derek knew his life was over. Lisa Martinez spent the next 4 months building the strongest case possible against Derek. She knew that putting a police officer on trial was always difficult because juries tended to give cops the benefit of the doubt. But this case was different. The evidence was so overwhelming that even the most cop-friendly juror would have trouble ignoring it. Lisa worked 16-hour days interviewing witnesses and reviewing documents. She traveled across 6 states to meet with truck drivers who had been victimized by Derek. Some of them were reluctant to get involved because they did not want to take time off work or relive the trauma of being extorted. But Lisa was patient and persuasive. She explained that their testimony could help put Derek away for decades and prevent him from hurting anyone else. One by one, the drivers agreed to cooperate. One of the drivers Lisa interviewed was a man named Paul Jenkins. Paul was a 52-year-old trucker from Alabama who had been stopped by Derek 18 months earlier. Derek had claimed to find cocaine in Paul's truck and demanded $4,000 to make the problem disappear. Paul had paid because he had a family to support and could not afford to go to jail. He had never told anyone about the incident because he was ashamed. When Lisa contacted him and explained that Derek had been arrested, Paul broke down crying on the phone. He agreed to testify and said he would do whatever it took to help convict Derek. Lisa thanked him and added his statement to the growing pile of evidence. Another driver was a woman named Angela Cruz. Angela was 38 years old and had been driving trucks for 15 years. She was one of the few who had refused to pay Derek. When Derek tried to extort her, she told him she would rather go to jail than give him a dime. Derek arrested her and charged her with possession of marijuana with intent to distribute. Angela spent 3 days in jail before her lawyer got the charges dismissed for lack of evidence. But by then she had lost her job, and her truck had been sold to pay the impound fees. Angela had to start over from nothing. When Lisa tracked her down, Angela was working as a dispatcher for a small trucking company and barely making ends meet. Lisa asked if she would testify against Derek. Angela said yes without hesitation. She said she wanted Derek to know what it felt like to lose everything. Lisa also worked closely with Carlos Ruiz to prepare his testimony. Carlos was being held in protective custody because testifying against drug traffickers was extremely dangerous. He had already received death threats from other members of the trafficking network. But Carlos was determined to cooperate because it was his only chance at a reduced sentence. He told Lisa everything he knew about Derek's involvement with the drug operation. He described meetings where Derek had provided information about law enforcement operations. He described payments he had made to Derek totaling over $100,000. He even had text messages and recorded phone calls that proved Derek was actively helping the traffickers avoid arrest. This evidence was devastating because it showed that Derek was not just a corrupt cop taking bribes. He was an active member of a criminal conspiracy. While Lisa built the case against Derek, Linda Hayes prepared for trial. She knew that Greg Palmer would try to attack the credibility of the witnesses. He would argue that the truck drivers were lying to get revenge. He would argue that Carlos was lying to get a deal. He would argue that the FBI had manufactured evidence because they wanted to make an example of a cop. Linda needed to anticipate every possible defense strategy and have a response ready. She worked with forensic experts to analyze the evidence. She worked with financial analysts to create charts and graphs showing Derek's illegal income. She worked with technology specialists to verify the authenticity of the phone records and text messages. Every piece of evidence needed to be bulletproof. 6 months after Derek's arrest, Linda felt ready to go to trial. She filed a motion with the court requesting a trial date. The judge set the trial to begin in 3 months. Greg Palmer immediately filed a series of motions trying to get evidence suppressed or dismissed. He argued that the FBI search of Derek's home had been illegal. The judge disagreed and denied the motion. He argued that Carlos Ruiz's testimony should be excluded because Carlos was an unreliable witness with a motive to lie. The judge disagreed and ruled that the jury would decide how much weight to give Carlos' testimony. He argued that statements from the truck drivers should be excluded because they were prejudicial. The judge disagreed again and said the statements were directly relevant to the charges. Greg was losing every motion and Derek's chances of acquittal were dropping to 0. Derek sat in his jail cell and watched his defense crumble. He had been in federal detention for 6 months and had lost over 30 pounds. He spent most of his days reading or staring at the ceiling. Other inmates knew he was a cop, and that made him a target. He had been beaten twice by other prisoners and had spent 2 weeks in the infirmary recovering from a broken rib. The guards moved him to protective custody, where he was locked in his cell 23 hours a day. The isolation was driving him insane. He thought about his old life constantly. His house and his wife and his job, all gone. He thought about the money he had made and how he had wasted it on stupid things like a new truck and expensive vacations. If he had been smarter, he could have hidden the money offshore where the FBI could not find it. But he had been arrogant and lazy, and now he was paying the price. Greg visited Derek once a week to discuss trial strategy, but there was no real strategy left. The evidence was too strong. Greg told Derek that his best option was to plead guilty and hope for mercy from the judge. Derek refused. He said he would take his chances with a jury. Greg explained that juries almost never acquitted cops when the evidence was this clear. He said Derek would be convicted and sentenced to the maximum penalty. Derek said he did not care. He would rather go down fighting than admit he was guilty. Greg sighed and said he would do his best, but that Derek needed to prepare for the worst. Marcus Williams had moved back to his regular life after spending 6 weeks in the safe house. The FBI determined that Derek had not compromised Marcus' identity and that it was safe for him to resume his normal routine. Marcus went back to driving trucks and tried to put the whole incident behind him, but he could not stop thinking about the trial. Lisa had told him that he would need to testify, and Marcus had agreed. But as the trial date approached, Marcus felt nervous. Testifying meant going to court and seeing Derek again. It meant reliving the whole experience. Marcus called Lisa and told her he was having second thoughts. Lisa drove to meet him in person. She sat down with Marcus in a truck stop diner and talked to him for 2 hours. She reminded him that his testimony was crucial. She said that without him, the case against Derek would be weaker. She said that Derek had victimized dozens of people, and Marcus had a chance to help deliver justice for all of them. Marcus listened and finally agreed to testify. He said he would do it for the other drivers who had suffered. The week before the trial began, Linda Hayes held a final meeting with all of her witnesses. She gathered them in a conference room at the federal courthouse and went over what would happen during the trial. She explained how the jury selection would work. She explained how she would present the evidence. She explained what kinds of questions Greg Palmer might ask during cross-examination. She told the witnesses to stay calm and tell the truth. She said that as long as they were honest, the jury would believe them. The witnesses listened carefully and asked questions. Paul Jenkins asked what would happen if he got nervous and forgot something. Linda said that was normal, and that he should just take his time and do his best. Angela Cruz asked if she would have to face Derek in court. Linda said yes, but that Derek would not be allowed to speak to her or come near her. Marcus asked how long the trial would last. Linda said probably 2 weeks. Everyone nodded and prepared themselves for what was coming. The trial began on a Monday morning in January. The courthouse was packed with reporters and spectators and family members of the victims. Derek was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked thin and tired. His hair had gone gray and his face was covered in stubble. He sat down next to Greg Palmer at the defense table and stared straight ahead. He did not look at the crowd or at the prosecutors. He just sat there like a man who had already given up. The jury selection took 2 days. Linda and Greg questioned dozens of potential jurors, trying to find 12 people who could be fair and impartial. Linda wanted jurors who would not automatically side with a police officer just because of his badge. Greg wanted jurors who would give Derek the benefit of the doubt and not rush to judgment. In the end, they selected 12 jurors, including 7 women and 5 men. The jurors ranged in age from 25 to 68. They came from different backgrounds and different parts of the state. The judge swore them in and instructed them on their duties. Then the trial began. Linda gave her opening statement first. She stood in front of the jury and spoke in a clear, firm voice. She told them that this case was about a police officer who had betrayed his oath and abused his power. She said that for 3 years, Derek had stopped innocent truck drivers and extorted money from them. She said he had planted evidence and lied in police reports and worked with drug traffickers. She said the evidence would show beyond any reasonable doubt that Derek was guilty of every charge. She spoke for 30 minutes, laying out the case piece by piece. When she finished, she thanked the jury and sat down. Greg gave his opening statement next. He told the jury that Derek was a good cop who had been doing a difficult job in a difficult area. He said that the FBI had targeted Derek because they needed a scapegoat for their own failures. He said that the witnesses who would testify against Derek were criminals and liars who could not be trusted. He said the evidence had been taken out of context and twisted to make Derek look guilty. He said that when the jury heard all the facts, they would see that Derek was innocent. He spoke for 20 minutes and then sat down. The jury looked skeptical. Linda called her first witness. It was an FBI forensic accountant named Stephen Moore. Stephen had analyzed Derek's financial records and created detailed charts showing the flow of money. He testified that Derek had deposited over $250,000 in cash over 3 years. He said there was no legitimate source for this money, and that the deposits coincided with traffic stops Derek had made. Greg tried to argue during cross-examination that the money could have come from investments or gifts. Stephen calmly explained that Derek had no documented investments and that gifts of this size would have required tax reporting. The jury took notes. The next witness was a technology specialist named Rachel Kim. She had analyzed Derek patrol car data and his phone records. She testified that Derek had manually turned off his body camera and dashboard camera dozens of times right before making traffic stops. She said this showed a deliberate pattern of hiding his activities. She also testified about phone calls between Derek and Carlos Ruiz that happened right after several traffic stops. Greg tried to suggest that the data could have been corrupted or misinterpreted. Rachel firmly stated that the data was accurate and that her analysis was sound. On the 3rd day of trial, Linda called Paul Jenkins to testify. Paul walked to the witness stand looking nervous. He was wearing a suit that was too big for him and his hands were shaking. Linda asked him to describe what happened when Derek stopped him. Paul told the story of how Derek had claimed to find cocaine in his truck and demanded $4,000. He said he had paid because he was terrified of going to jail and losing everything. His voice broke several times as he spoke. When Linda finished her questions, Greg stood up for cross-examination. He asked Paul if he had ever been arrested before. Paul said yes for a DUI 10 years ago. Greg asked if Paul had a grudge against police officers. Paul said no. Greg asked if Paul had been promised anything by the FBI in exchange for his testimony. Paul said no. Greg tried to make Paul look unreliable, but Paul stuck to his story. The jury looked sympathetic. Angela Cruz testified next. She told her story of refusing to pay Derek and being arrested on false charges. She described losing her job and her truck and having to rebuild her life from nothing. She spoke with anger in her voice and tears in her eyes. She looked directly at Derek several times while she testified. Derek looked away. Greg tried to attack Angela's credibility during cross-examination, but she did not back down. She said she had nothing to gain from lying and everything to gain from seeing Derek held accountable. The jury nodded in agreement. Over the next week, Linda called 15 more truck drivers to testify. Each one told a similar story. Derek had stopped them and found or planted evidence and demanded money. Some had paid. Others had refused and faced arrest. All of them had been victimized. The testimony was repetitive, but that was the point. Linda wanted the jury to see the pattern. This was not one mistake or one bad stop. This was a systematic criminal operation that had gone on for years. The cumulative effect of all the testimony was devastating. By the end of the week, several jurors were visibly angry. On the 10th day of trial, Linda called Marcus Williams to testify. For security reasons, the courtroom was cleared of all spectators and media. Only the judge and jury and lawyers and Derek were allowed to remain. Marcus walked to the witness stand and was sworn in. Linda asked him to describe what happened the night Derek stopped him. Marcus spoke calmly and clearly. He described the stop and the planted drugs and Derek's attempt to extort $5,000. He explained that he had activated his FBI emergency alert and that agents had arrived quickly. He said Derek had no idea who he was dealing with until it was too late. Greg asked Marcus during cross-examination if he was a criminal. The judge immediately sustained Linda's objection. Greg tried again, asking if Marcus had ever been involved in illegal activity. The judge warned Greg that Marcus' background was not relevant. Greg sat down frustrated. The most damaging testimony came from Carlos Ruiz. Carlos was brought into the courtroom in shackles and wearing a prison uniform. He looked scared but determined. Linda asked him to describe his relationship with Derek. Carlos explained that Derek had contacted him 3 years ago and offered to provide information about truck routes and law enforcement operations in exchange for money. He said Derek had been reliable and had helped the trafficking network avoid several arrests. He said he had paid Derek over $100,000 in cash. He provided details about specific meetings and phone calls. He even had text messages that had been recovered from his phone showing conversations with Derek about payments. Greg attacked Carlos' credibility hard during cross-examination. He pointed out that Carlos was a convicted drug dealer facing decades in prison. He suggested that Carlos was lying to get a reduced sentence, but Carlos did not waver. He said he was telling the truth because it was his only chance at redemption. The jury looked convinced. Linda rested her case after 12 days of testimony. She had presented overwhelming evidence of Derek's guilt. Now it was Greg's turn to present a defense. But Greg had almost nothing to work with. He called a few character witnesses who testified that Derek had been a good cop and a good person. He called an expert witness who tried to suggest that the forensic evidence could be interpreted differently. But none of it made much difference. The evidence against Derek was too strong. Greg rested his case after 2 days. The trial moved to closing arguments. Linda Hayes stood before the jury for her closing argument. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment and she knew exactly what she needed to say. She began by thanking the jury for their service and attention. Then she walked them through the evidence one more time. She reminded them of the financial records showing Derek's unexplained income. She reminded them of the phone records linking Derek to Carlos Ruiz. She reminded them of the patrol car data showing Derek had deliberately turned off his cameras. And most importantly, she reminded them of the testimony from 17 truck drivers who had all told the same story. Derek had abused his power as a police officer to extort money from innocent people. He had planted evidence and lied in reports and worked with drug traffickers. Linda's voice grew stronger as she spoke. She told the jury that Derek had betrayed everything a police officer should stand for. He had taken an oath to protect and serve, but instead he had chosen to steal and intimidate. She said that Derek's actions had hurt not just his victims, but every honest cop who tried to do their job with integrity. She said the jury had a responsibility to hold Derek accountable and send a message that no one is above the law. She spoke for 45 minutes, and when she finished, several jurors were nodding. Greg Palmer stood up for his closing argument. He knew he was fighting an uphill battle, but he had to try. He told the jury that the prosecution had presented a lot of evidence, but that evidence could be misleading. He said that Derek had been a cop for 15 years and had made thousands of traffic stops. Out of those thousands, only a handful of people claimed he had done anything wrong. He suggested that these people were lying or exaggerating because they had been caught with drugs and wanted someone to blame. He said that Carlos Ruiz was a career criminal who would say anything to reduce his sentence. He argued that the financial evidence could be explained by legitimate sources that Derek had not properly documented. He said that turning off body cameras was common practice when officers needed to protect confidential informants or sensitive information. He urged the jury not to rush to judgment and to remember that Derek was innocent until proven guilty. He spoke for 30 minutes, but his argument sounded weak even to him. When he sat down, Derek looked at him with empty eyes. The judge instructed the jury on the law and sent them to deliberate. It was late afternoon, and the judge said they could deliberate until evening or return the next morning. The jury chose to start immediately. They filed out of the courtroom into the jury room. Linda and her team waited in the prosecutor office. Greg and Derek waited in a small conference room. Marcus had already left the courthouse and returned to his safe house. He would be notified when a verdict came in. The jury deliberated for 5 hours that first day before the judge sent them home for the night. They returned the next morning and deliberated for another hour. Then they sent a note to the judge saying they had reached a verdict. The bailiff called everyone back to the courtroom. Linda and her team hurried in and took their seats. Greg and Derek came in looking tense. The spectators filled the gallery. The judge entered and everyone stood. Then the judge asked the jury foreman if they had reached a verdict. The foreman was a middle-aged man who worked as an engineer. He stood up and said yes. The judge asked him to hand the verdict form to the bailiff. The bailiff brought it to the judge, who read it silently. Then the judge handed it back to the bailiff, who returned it to the foreman. The judge asked the foreman to read the verdict. The foreman cleared his throat and began reading. On count 1, racketeering, the jury found Derek guilty. On count 2, extortion, the jury found Derek guilty. On count 3, conspiracy to distribute drugs, the jury found Derek guilty. The foreman continued reading through all 47 counts. Every single count came back guilty. Derek sat perfectly still as the verdict was read. He showed no emotion. Greg put his hand on Derek's shoulder, but Derek did not react. When the foreman finished reading, the judge thanked the jury for their service. The judge said sentencing would be scheduled in 6 weeks. The bailiff took Derek away in handcuffs. Linda and her team hugged each other. Several of the truck drivers who had testified were in the gallery, and they clapped quietly. Justice had been served. The news of the verdict spread quickly. Local television stations led their evening broadcasts with the story. National news picked it up as well. The headline was always the same: corrupt cop convicted on all counts for extorting truck drivers. Editorials praised the FBI for their thorough investigation. Police reform advocates used the case as an example of why oversight and accountability were necessary. Derek's former colleagues at the Ridgeline Police Department said they were relieved the case was over. The new police chief gave an interview saying the department had implemented reforms to prevent this from ever happening again. But the damage to the department reputation would take years to repair. 6 weeks later, Derek was brought back to court for sentencing. The courtroom was packed again. Several of Derek's victims had come to give impact statements. The judge allowed them to speak one at a time. Paul Jenkins went first. He stood at a podium and read from a prepared statement. He said that Derek's actions had caused him tremendous financial and emotional harm. He said he still had nightmares about being stopped on the highway and being threatened with arrest. He said he hoped Derek would spend the rest of his life in prison. Angela Cruz spoke next. She said that Derek had destroyed her career and her livelihood. She said she had worked hard to rebuild her life, but the trauma of what Derek had done still affected her every day. She said Derek deserved no mercy. One by one, the victims spoke. Their statements were emotional and powerful. Linda Hayes also gave a statement recommending the maximum sentence. She said Derek had committed crimes over a period of 3 years involving dozens of victims. She said he had shown no remorse and had lied repeatedly. She said he had betrayed his oath and his community. She recommended that Derek be sentenced to at least 35 years in federal prison. Greg Palmer gave a statement asking for leniency. He said Derek had a family and had once been a good officer. He said that Derek had made mistakes but deserved a chance at redemption. He asked the judge to consider a sentence of 15 years. The judge listened to both sides without comment. Then the judge spoke. Her name was Patricia Coleman, and she had been a federal judge for 20 years. She had a reputation for being tough but fair. She looked down at Derek and began speaking. She said she had reviewed all the evidence and all the testimony. She said she had read the victim impact statements and the sentencing recommendations. She said that Derek's crimes were among the most serious she had ever seen in her courtroom. She said that police officers were given extraordinary power and authority, and that when they abused that power, the damage was profound. She said Derek had not just broken the law. He had shattered the trust between law enforcement and the community. She said he had victimized vulnerable people who had no way to defend themselves. She said he had worked with drug traffickers and helped them avoid justice. She said there were no mitigating factors that could excuse his conduct. Then she announced the sentence. Derek would serve 32 years in federal prison on the racketeering charge. Additional sentences on the other charges would run concurrently. Derek would also be required to pay restitution to his victims in the amount of $400,000. The judge said Derek would not be eligible for parole. When she finished speaking, she asked Derek if he had anything to say. Derek stood up slowly. He looked at the judge and then at the victims in the gallery. For a moment it seemed like he might apologize, but instead he just said, "No, Your Honor." The judge nodded and ordered the bailiff to take Derek into custody. Derek was led out of the courtroom for the last time. Derek was transferred to a federal prison in Colorado. It was a medium security facility that housed around 1,500 inmates. Derek was placed in a unit with other prisoners who had been law enforcement officers or government officials. The prison separated these inmates from the general population for their own safety. Even in this protected unit, Derek was not welcome. The other inmates knew what he had done, and they had no respect for a cop who had betrayed his badge. Derek spent most of his time alone in his cell reading books from the prison library. He had 32 years ahead of him. He would be 72 years old when he was released. If he even lived that long. His ex-wife Karen moved on with her life. She sold their house and moved to another state to escape the media attention. She changed her last name back to her maiden name and tried to forget that she had ever been married to Derek. She started a new job and eventually started dating again. Sometimes she thought about the man she had married and wondered how she had not seen what he was becoming. But mostly she just tried not to think about him at all. Derek tried to call her a few times from prison, but she never accepted the calls. There was nothing left to say. The town of Ridgeline slowly recovered from the scandal. The police department hired a new chief who came from outside the area. His name was Frank Murphy, and he had a reputation as a reformer. He fired 3 more officers who had been involved in Derek's scheme. He implemented new training programs focused on ethics and accountability. He created a civilian oversight board that reviewed all complaints against officers. He installed cameras in all patrol cars and made sure they could not be turned off. He met with community leaders and promised that things would be different. Some people believed him. Others remained skeptical. But gradually trust began to rebuild. It would take years, but the department was moving in the right direction. Marcus Williams continued driving his truck across the country. The trial had been stressful but also cathartic. He had faced Derek in court and told the truth and seen justice done. That meant something to Marcus. He felt like he had helped not just himself but all the other victims. Lisa Martinez still checked in with him regularly. She called him every few weeks to make sure he was safe and to see how he was doing. Marcus appreciated her concern. Over time, they developed a genuine friendship. Lisa told Marcus that his testimony had been crucial to the case. She said that without him, Derek might have gotten away with everything. Marcus said he was just glad he could help. The FBI investigation into the Ridgeline Police Department continued for another year. They uncovered evidence of corruption involving 6 officers in total. All of them were charged and convicted. The scandal extended beyond just extortion. Some officers had been stealing money from evidence rooms. Others had been accepting bribes from local businesses to ignore code violations. The entire department had been rotten from the inside. The federal investigation cleaned it out completely. By the time it was over, only half of the original officers remained. The rest had been fired or arrested or had quit. The department was essentially rebuilt from scratch. Several of Derek's victims filed civil lawsuits against the town of Ridgeline. They argued that the town had failed to supervise Derek properly and had allowed his crimes to continue for years. The town settled most of the lawsuits out of court. The total cost was over $5 million. The money came from the town insurance policy and from a special tax levy. The taxpayers were angry about having to pay for Derek crimes, but they understood that the victims deserved compensation. Some good came from the settlements. The town used the scandal as motivation to reform not just the police department, but all of its government operations. They implemented transparency measures and accountability standards. They hired an ethics officer to review all government activities. They created a hotline for reporting corruption. Ridgeline became a model for other small towns trying to prevent similar scandals. Paul Jenkins used his settlement money to start a small trucking company. He hired drivers who had been victimized by corrupt cops and gave them a fair wage and good benefits. He created a company culture based on respect and integrity. His business grew slowly but steadily. Paul felt like he had turned something terrible into something positive. Angela Cruz also used her settlement money to restart her career. She bought a used truck and got her commercial license reinstated. She went back to driving long-haul routes. She said that Derek had taken away her livelihood for a while, but he had not broken her spirit. She was tougher than that. She made a point to drive through Ridgeline whenever her routes took her that way. Every time she passed through, she thought about Derek sitting in prison, and it made her smile. Marcus thought about Derek sometimes too. Not with satisfaction or anger, but with a kind of sad understanding. Marcus had seen a lot of corruption in his life. He had seen cartel members murder people for money. He had seen cops and judges and politicians sell their souls for power. Derek was just one more example of what happened when people chose greed over principle. But Marcus had also seen good people. People like Lisa who dedicated their lives to justice. People like the truck drivers who had found the courage to testify. People like the new police chief in Ridgeline who was trying to make things better. Marcus believed that the good people outnumbered the bad. It was just that the bad ones made more noise. 3 years after the trial, Marcus was driving through Arizona on his way to California. He decided to take a detour through Ridgeline. He wanted to see the town where everything had happened. He drove down the main street and looked at the buildings and the people. It looked like any other small town. Quiet and ordinary. He drove past the police station and saw patrol cars parked outside with their lights off. Officers were standing in the parking lot talking and laughing. They looked like normal cops doing a normal job. Marcus wondered if they knew the history of their department. He wondered if they understood how close they had come to losing everything. He hoped they did. He hoped they remembered what happened when people in power forgot their responsibilities. Marcus pulled into a truck stop on the edge of town to get fuel. While the tank was filling, he went inside to get coffee. The cashier was a young woman, probably in her 20s. She rang up his coffee and asked if he was just passing through. Marcus said yes. She asked where he was headed. Marcus said California. She said she had always wanted to go to California. Marcus said it was nice this time of year. She smiled and wished him safe travels. Marcus walked back to his truck and climbed into the cab. He sat there for a moment, drinking his coffee and looking out at the highway. He thought about all the miles he had driven and all the places he had been. He thought about the warehouse in El Paso and the men he had seen killed. He thought about the trial and the testimony and the verdict. He thought about Derek sitting in a prison cell for the next 3 decades. Marcus did not feel happy about it, but he felt at peace. Justice had been served. The system had worked. Not perfectly and not quickly, but it had worked. Marcus started his engine and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched out ahead of him, empty and endless. The sun was setting behind him, casting long shadows across the desert. Marcus turned on the radio and found a station playing old country songs. He settled into his seat and let the miles roll by. He had deliveries to make and places to be. He had a life to live, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt truly free. Free from fear and free from the past and free to just be himself. He was not a witness anymore. He was not a target. He was just a man doing his job and living his life. That was enough. That was everything. Marcus smiled and kept driving into the fading light. The road went on forever, and Marcus was ready for whatever came next. Derek was arrested at his home on a Tuesday morning. 6 FBI agents arrived with a warrant and found him eating breakfast with his wife. His wife's name was Karen, and she had no idea what her husband had been doing for the past 3 years. She watched in shock as the agents handcuffed Derek and read him his rights. She asked what was happening, and one of the agents told her that Derek was being charged with multiple federal crimes. Karen started crying. Derek looked at her and said nothing. There was nothing he could say that would make this better. The agents searched the house and found $20,000 in cash hidden in the garage. They seized it as evidence. They also took Derek's laptop and his personal phone. Then they led him out to a waiting car and drove him to the federal courthouse in Phoenix. Derek was processed and fingerprinted and photographed. Then he was taken to a holding cell to wait for his arraignment. Greg Palmer arrived an hour later and met with Derek in a small conference room. Greg told Derek that the charges were serious and that he was looking at decades in prison if convicted. He asked Derek if there was anything he wanted to tell him that might help with the defense. Derek said he had been set up. He said the FBI was targeting him because he was a cop who actually enforced the law. Greg listened and nodded, but his expression showed he did not believe a word of it. He had read the indictment and seen the evidence. This was not a setup. This was a cop who had gotten greedy and stupid. The arraignment was held that afternoon. Derek stood before a federal judge and listened as the charges were read aloud. 47 counts including racketeering, extortion, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. The judge asked how he pleaded. Derek said not guilty in a voice that was barely audible. The prosecutor, Linda Hayes, asked for Derek to be held without bail. She argued that Derek was a flight risk and a danger to witnesses. Greg argued that Derek had ties to the community and no prior criminal record. He said Derek should be released on bond with an ankle monitor. The judge considered both arguments and ruled that Derek would be held without bail pending trial. The judge said the evidence of witness tampering and criminal conspiracy was too strong to risk Derek being free. Derek was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs and taken to a federal detention center. Karen hired Greg to represent Derek, but she had no idea how she would pay for it. Greg's fees were expensive and the FBI had seized most of their savings. She called her parents and asked for help. They agreed to take out a second mortgage on their house to pay for Derek's defense. Karen also filed for divorce. She told her friends that she could not stay married to a man who had betrayed everything she thought he stood for. The divorce papers were served to Derek in jail 2 weeks after his arrest. Derek signed them without contest. He had already lost everything else. Losing his marriage felt almost expected. The news of Derek's arrest spread quickly through the town of Ridgeline. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with Derek's mugshot and a detailed account of the charges. The story described him as a corrupt cop who had shaken down innocent truck drivers for years. The police department issued a statement saying they were shocked and disappointed by Derek's actions. They said they were cooperating fully with the federal investigation and had placed several other officers on administrative leave pending review. The truth was that Derek had not been working alone. Several other cops in the department had known what he was doing and had looked the other way. Some had even taken small payments to ignore certain violations. The FBI investigation was far from over. Marcus read about Derek's arrest from the safe house. Lisa brought him a copy of the newspaper and let him read the article. Marcus felt a sense of relief but also sadness. Relief that Derek would face justice. Sadness that it had taken this long for anyone to stop him. Marcus thought about all the other drivers who had been victimized by Derek over the years. Drivers who had paid money they could not afford to pay. Drivers who had lost their jobs or their freedom. Marcus had been lucky because the FBI was already protecting him. But what about everyone else? Lisa told Marcus that the FBI was reaching out to as many victims as they could find. She said they would all have a chance to testify at trial if they wanted to. Marcus said he would testify. He said he owed it to the others. While Derek sat in jail, the FBI continued building their case. They brought in forensic accountants to trace every dollar Derek had received. They interviewed Derek's former colleagues and friends. They searched his patrol car and found DNA evidence from multiple people who had been in the vehicle over the years. Some of that DNA matched drivers who had reported being extorted by Derek. The forensic evidence was mounting. The FBI also worked on flipping Carlos Ruiz. They arrested Carlos and offered him a deal. If he testified against Derek and provided information about the drug trafficking network, the FBI would recommend a reduced sentence. Carlos agreed. He had no loyalty to Derek and saw no reason to protect him. Carlos told the FBI everything. He explained how Derek had first approached him 3 years ago, offering to provide information about truck routes in exchange for money. Carlos had been skeptical at first, but Derek had proven reliable. Over time, their arrangement had expanded. Derek would stop trucks and search them under the guise of law enforcement. If he found anything suspicious, he would report it to Carlos. If he found nothing, He would plant drugs and extort the driver. Either way, Derek made money. Carlos also revealed that Derek had helped the trafficking network avoid several law enforcement operations by tipping them off about planned raids. This made Derek not just a corrupt cop, but an active traitor to his badge. Linda Hayes added additional charges to the indictment based on Carlos' testimony. She charged Derek with providing material support to drug traffickers and with obstruction of federal law enforcement operations. These charges carried mandatory minimum sentences that could not be reduced even with a plea deal. Derek's legal situation went from bad to impossible. Greg Palmer met with Derek in jail and laid out the reality. If Derek went to trial and was convicted, he would spend at least 30 years in federal prison. If he took a plea deal and cooperated with prosecutors, he might be able to reduce that to 15 or 20 years. Derek asked what cooperation would involve. Greg said it would mean testifying against other corrupt officers in his department and providing information about the drug trafficking network. Derek would have to admit everything and help the FBI take down everyone else involved. Derek sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he asked what would happen if he refused. Greg said then he would go to trial and almost certainly be convicted on all counts. The evidence was overwhelming. Derek had no real defense. He could claim he was entrapped or that the evidence was fabricated, but no jury would believe it. Derek told Greg he needed time to think. Back in Ridgeline, the police department was falling apart. The police chief had resigned under pressure from the mayor. 3 other officers had been arrested on corruption charges related to Derek's scheme. 2 more had quit before they could be charged. The department was being investigated by the state attorney general office and by the FBI. The town council held emergency meetings to discuss how to restore public trust. They hired an outside consulting firm to review the department policies and procedures. They implemented mandatory body cameras for all officers and created an independent oversight board to review complaints. But the damage had been done. The community had lost faith in the police, and it would take years to rebuild that trust. Citizens who had been stopped by Derek or the other corrupt officers came forward with complaints. Some filed civil lawsuits against the town seeking damages for false arrest and violation of their rights. The town legal bills were mounting into the millions of dollars. The mayor appeared on television and apologized to the community. She promised that things would change and that corrupt officers would be held accountable. But her words felt empty to many people who had been victimized. They wanted more than apologies. They wanted justice.